Okay, so our speaker tonight is Mr. Tip O'Neill. Oh, no, Tip O'Neill, right. Mr.
Brolin.
Brolin. He's a volunteer with the Climate Lobby. The Climate Lobby is a nonprofit, nonpartisan national organization focused on national policies to address climate change. Next slide, please. And let's see, get that out of the way. They propose a carbon-free and dividend policy as a means of minimizing the burning of carbon-based fuels. This policy would make goods that use fossil fuels more expensive and return the funds collected to all households on an equal basis. Mr. Brolin is a retired executive who is responsible for nuclear energy research and development in government and industry. He is also a past chairman of the Sustainable Southampton Green Energy Advisory Committee. That's a mouthful. Mr. Brolin will provide the fundamentals of climate change, the consequences of no action, what the Citizen Climate Lobby proposes, and progress since he last spoke in 2017. I can't type. So with that, I will get off the screen and turn it over to Mr. Brolin.
Thank you. Let's see. I am. There. So as Byron said, I'm here representing Citizens Climate Lobby. Some things have changed, made progress since I last talked with you. Now the question is, how do I advance my slides, which don't seem to want to advance? There. I joined Citizens Climate Lobby in 2014. At that point, we had 12,000 members. Now we have approaching 200,000 members and are active in 16 countries. This is our purpose. It's the only organization of which I'm aware where it's a singular mission. In theory, we could go out of business after a law that's currently being considered in Congress was passed, but we aren't there yet. So this is what I'm going to talk about. Please excuse me if I'm telling you things you already knew, but the greenhouse effect, of course, is what keeps planet Earth habitable. The sun gives light in the form of light energy to the Earth. Some of that is reflected and reflected back to the Earth from our atmosphere. That's these purple arrows. As long as this stays reasonably in balance, we're okay. Now it has gotten out of balance, and I'll go into those areas later in the talk. And when that happens, there are real problems. So if we increase the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, more energy is contained within that, if you will, greenhouse roof. The reason is that although the light from the sun comes through the atmosphere largely, whoops, sorry. When it's reflected, it changes wavelength. It comes in as visible light. It goes out as infrared radiation. The infrared radiation is reflected more severely by the atmosphere. And the more greenhouse gases, the more that's reflected. It's the same kind of effect you see in your car in the winter. If you go out, it's cold, you open your car, the heater hasn't been on, but it's warm inside. That's because the windshield acts the same way that our atmosphere acts. It reflects back into the car some of the infrared radiation that is being given off by the inside of the car. So this is good, but again, you can see that if it reflects too much, that is, we have too much of a greenhouse gas level in the atmosphere, then the Earth gets warmer. Now, here's what's happened. This is only 800,000 years, but and much of this data, by the way, comes from the NASA website, if you'd like to check it out. Here is what's happened since the Industrial Revolution. The CO2 concentration in the atmosphere has skyrocketed. You may remember Bill McGibbon's organization, which still exists, called 350.org. That was before we got to 350 parts per million. We zoomed past that. The last time I spoke with you, in fact, we were at 407 parts per million. That was 2017. We're now at 416. And as you can see, there's been no slowing down. It's almost a straight line of adding carbon dioxide and its equivalent greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. There's been a lot of talk, which is added to the carbon dioxide, but at the same time, not a lot of action. So because of this, the climate is changing. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which puts out a periodic report, has made this statement. I do sense one improvement since I last talked with you, and with time, I think more people believe it's happening. Partly that's because we've had a lot of wildfires, things like that, some of which may be just weather, but a large part of it is probably caused by a change in the Earth's temperature. So the world believes this, that is, the world in the form of the scientific world. Is this a problem? Let me see if I can get rid of this. No, I can't, I guess. More severe storms, more drought. We certainly see that and have for a number of years now in the West here. Ocean heating and sea level rise. Of course, sea level is rising largely because the ocean is getting warmer. When the water heats up, it expands. The consequences ultimately of this can be catastrophic. Billions of dollars, certainly hundreds of thousands of lives, wars over water, some parts of the earth becoming uninhabitable, as some are now. And this little detail down here, we could all die. That's something you only read about occasionally in the newspaper, although it is there. So there was, I think, an article last year in the Times publicizing some scientific conclusions. We've had, I believe, 6 major extinctions that we know about, going back millions of years, tens of millions of years, which we can find from the geological record. The latest scientific thinking is that 5 of those were due to global heating. And I use that word advisory. We're past the warming stage. This is global heating. The one that isn't was the one where the meteor or meteorite hit the Yucatan Peninsula and wiped out the dinosaurs and a lot of other life on the earth. So how did these happen? First, at that time, of course, there were no humans. Volcanic activity released greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We got global heating as a result, although not nearly as rapidly as we're seeing now. The warmer ocean is normally saturated with oxygen, but as it warms up, it can't contain as much oxygen. As a result, the normal decay process of bacteria and other things in the ocean, which normally would produce CO2, produces hydrogen sulfide, because at the bottom of the ocean, not necessarily all the way at the bottom, there is a layer of water which is saturated with hydrogen sulfide and not oxygen. This effect with the warmer ocean water increases that. That water replaces the oxygen saturated water ocean-wide. And the hydrogen sulfide, which is poisonous, escapes into the air. Graphically, this comes from this article by Dr. Peter Ward from 2006. Actually, it was reading that article that got me interested in this. It's frankly quite scary. So the hydrogen sulfide in the ocean comes to the surface, gives off H2S to the air. Certain sulfur bacteria like it very much. The animals and plants we know, not so much, since it would kill us. And lest anyone think that this is far in the future, this is a photograph from a satellite in 2002, almost 20 years ago, which shows this annual upwelling of hydrogen sulfide off the coast of Namibia. This is, I think, pretty shallow water. Of course, that's a very hot area. So it's happening now. And the bottom line, of course, of all that is you have an extinction. 90 to 95% of the plants and animals that are based on an oxygen cycle die. That would, of course, include us. The interesting thing I found in preparing or updating my previous talk is that when I looked at the rate of CO2 increase and compared it to how long would it take to get to 900 parts per million, which doesn't guarantee you'll have an extinction then, but they didn't happen before that, at lower levels, was that it was 2215. That was my conclusion in 2017. Using the same arithmetic, it's still 2215. In fact, we haven't made any progress about putting it off. It's still going at about 2.5 parts per million per year. So you should become a little worried at this point. So far, what have we got? For 800,000 years, our CO2 has been below 300 parts per million. Now we're above 400 parts per million, increasing steadily. And it's caused by burning fossil fuels. We know that because we can calculate the increase in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere by measuring how much in fossil fuels we've burned. We have burned enough fossil fuels to have twice the increase we've caused. The rest of the CO2 has gone into the ocean, which is now more acidic than it was before because it's absorbing this CO2. So it's easy to confirm, or it's easy for some people to confirm that we're causing this. The Earth's temperature is rising as a result, can't explain from natural causes, and we should definitely be worried. So what should we be doing? Emphasize we, because I think given the political situation in particular, it's we who have to do something. So obviously we want to cut back on fossil fuels, but we don't want to wreck our lives. So I think if you step back from it, I see two options. One is top-down regulation, which some in the government would prefer, but the other is to incentivize people to get away from fossil fuels, to do things that are good for the environment. I think the average person favors incentivizing people. Plus, politically, the first option is not realistic. So here's where we get back to CCL. CCL proposes, continually, a system called carbon fee and dividend. So a fee is placed on the fossil fuel companies, either where the coal comes out of the mine or the oil comes out of the ground, starting at $15 per ton of CO2 and escalating every year up to $100 a ton. One thing you may not be aware of, I wasn't until I looked it up, but if you burn 1 ton of coal, you produce 2 tons of CO2. The average price of coal now is around, it varies depending on the type of coal, around $50 per ton. If you put a $15, let alone $100 tax on that, you increase, clearly, you increase the price of coal till it's no longer feasible to use, which is the purpose. But what's new is we get the money back. So you may pay in the form of increased gas taxes, say, and if you own a gas guzzler, you'll pay more than if you don't own a car. However, everyone would get the money back equally. You and I would get the same amount back, no matter how much fuel we burned. The result, of course, is to make fossil fuels and the industries that depend on them less attractive, more expensive, and the non-fossil products less so, cheaper. The idea, of course, is to cause us to move away from fossil fuels, but do so in a way that doesn't say, okay, you've got to have an electric car. I don't want to have an electric car. What can I do? Well, then you pay for the privilege of polluting the atmosphere. And eventually, the average person is going to get the message, just as taxes always cause people to change their behavior. To repeat, the money comes back to all of us on an equal per family basis. Actually, the draft law that's in Congress now would give each adult a full share of the rebate and each child a half share up to a maximum of 2 per family. By the way, I should mention, as you've probably noticed, I have a slight tremor. It's not Parkinson's, it's not serious, but it's something I have to live with. So I apologize if it's distracting. Anyway, those who use more pay more in fees. Those who use less get more back than they paid. And I'll give you some facts on that, which should move us away from carbon use. And in fact, there's evidence that it does. So, excuse me, who benefits? Well, this is from the study that's noted there. Each vertical bar represents, each vertical bar represents 1/5, that is the first lowest 20% of the income spectrum, then the next 20% higher, etc. And what this says is that because of the inability, because they don't have a lot of money of this group, say, they don't pay nearly as much in carbon taxes as they get back from the government. In fact, $6.4 billion would be distributed to those. And as you can see, as you increase the amount of money that people make, you get to the point where they do pay more in fees than they get back. And the more money you make, the more likely that is to happen. So in that sense, it's a progressive tax. So the benefit, if you look at this over a period of decades, this doesn't happen instantly. But what happens is, because you're giving more money back to people who need it and who really have to have it to live, they spend it. And they spend it, it creates more jobs. Sorry. 2.1 million more jobs would be created after 10 years. It reduces the carbon dioxide, and there you're looking at emissions cut in half in 20 years. Increases household income. We've discussed that. This is not as obvious, but cutting down on emissions is better for people's health. Therefore, 13,000 lives are expected to be saved annually after 10 years. And finally, over a 20-year period, we would add $1.3 trillion to the GDP. Now, the point isn't that all these numbers are sacrosanct. There's studies done by economists. I happen to have met the economist who did this study. He's a very impressive guy, but he may be wrong in some ways. The point is, there isn't any real economic case to be made against carbon fee and dividend. It is better for the economy, whether it's this good but it's definitely better. So where has it worked? Canada, specifically, it was started in British Columbia in 2008. They started, actually, this is a mistake. They started at $5 a ton and have gone up to $30 a ton of CO2 emissions. They didn't choose to send the money back the way carbon fee and dividend proposes to work. They did it by tax reduction in personal income tax rates. Fuel use is down, that's what this curve shows. Prior to this introduction, British Columbia was tracking the rest of Canada as far as fuel use per capita. After this was introduced, it went down significantly. The GDP went up the number of jobs went up, and it was very popular. Now, back when this was introduced, and I don't remember who the Canadian Prime Minister was, perhaps Justin Trudeau, he intended to apply this across Canada if it worked in British Columbia. Well, it did work in British Columbia, but he met resistance, as you expect. It sounds like a tax and people don't believe it'll work. However, finally this year, 7 of the 13 Canadian provinces will use this. So this is a real world test that it seems to work. But we have our own hill to climb here in convincing Congress. To get back to Citizens Climate Lobby, that's what we're focused on. But it's these 195,000 plus members who have to help, have to do the work, really. And this is the kind of thing that we try to do. With COVID, it has been hard to get people's attention on a subject as seemingly long-term as climate change, of course. But the climate is continuing to change whether there's COVID or not. So we have to continue to work on it. I don't think he's on here now, but one of my colleagues, John Andrews, has gone to 1 or 2 of these annual DC, semi-annual DC lobbying efforts. About 800 people from CCL, volunteers, go to Washington and meet with every congressman or their senior staff. If the congressman's not available, try to convince him that this is the thing to do. You can do that too, although you don't have to. Writing letters to the editor, writing letters to Lee Zeldin, all these things help. Now, what have we done since I last talked to you? CCL was instrumental in forming this Congressional Climate Solutions Caucus. These are the members in the Senate and the House. That looks good, and it is good, but keep in mind that Congressman Zeldin is a member of this, and he has not supported these measures at all. So if I were Machiavellian, and I confess to being a bit, I would join this just to see what the other side's doing. Of more significance, perhaps, is carbon fee and dividend in the form of this Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act has been introduced in 2 successive Congresses now. It's very close to what I just explained to you. Certainly all the principles of carbon fee and dividend are in it. It has these number of co-sponsors. It started with 1 co-sponsor, a Republican and 1 Democrat. I think the Republican has subsequently left the Congress. So I should know the answer, but most of these people are Democrats. But they are increasing, and that's the good news. So in summary, climate change is real, it's caused by us, and it's potentially disastrous. Carbon fee and dividend embodies what all the experts say is the most important thing we can do to fight climate change, which is to put a price on carbon. This has the advantage of, in addition, helping people who are doing the right thing by giving them money back. We have to motivate our Congress people to get behind it. And that's where citizensclimatelobby.org comes in. Thank you. If you have questions, please ask.
Hi, this is Byron. Let me clarify. You said Lee Zeldin was not involved in this?
Lee Zeldin is a member of the Climate Solutions Caucus, but he has done nothing to actually help this along.
Tiff, can you
Yes?
can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you compare what it was recently in the news that Biden is proposing doing, how it compares to the fee and dividend route?
I can't, because I'm not familiar in detail with what he's proposing. The only bill that's actually been introduced is the one I mentioned, which is carbon fee and dividend.
Thank you.
There are other bills that one of the, I think, potential disadvantages of many of the bills is the federal government keeps the money and it gets distributed to whichever party, you know, their favorite beneficiaries. And of course, that antagonizes the other party. And this isn't going to happen without bipartisan support. So I think this is about as neutral as you can get.
Yeah.
Tip, what do you think the chances are of getting carbon pricing passed this year? I mean, CCL seems to be very optimistic about it, but some other people I've talked to are less optimistic.
Well, I worked for the federal government in Washington for 20 years, so I have a hard time being optimistic. But I think given that the Republicans and Democrats are essentially evenly split, if one or the other takes firm control of the Senate and the House at the midterms, then it either has a reasonable chance or no chance at all. It doesn't mean we go away, but it would be a real blow because the Republicans are not going to pass this.
Although some Republicans have become co-sponsors.
Very few, but I'm not saying it won't happen. I certainly hope. I mean, I'm old enough to have, the first president I voted for was probably JFK. So I've seen some swings in how the Congress behaves and how the people behave. I'm sure we all hope that everyone will get together and think about the greater good.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I have a question.
Oh, my wife has a question.
What?
Yes.
Hello, this is my question. I don't know if any of you would be interested to ask him why he spends so much time, this former nuclear engineer, on doing this when he is essentially a very practical man and not terribly optimistic about it, and yet he thinks it's of prime importance.
Yes.
Why is it of prime importance?
We all think it's of prime importance. That's why we're here.
Right. I think it's obvious that people are concerned about this because it is, I mean, it sounds like hyperbole, but it is at least the future of the human race on the planet will be severely impacted by this.
Yeah.
So I can't think of anything more important or frankly, anything more difficult in getting politicians interested. Because if you want to think long-term, this is pretty long-term.
Yeah. It's just frustrating with politicians like Zeldin because there just doesn't seem to be any way to move him. People have been trying for a long time. And I don't know whether he has grandchildren. I always think that if people are thinking of their grandchildren, they would take this more seriously, but apparently not, because it's unlikely. I mean, I don't think I'll see 2215, but the grandchildren will. But they don't seem to think about the future. It's just, you know.
I can't answer that.
Or elect somebody else besides Zeldin, but we've been trying to do that for a while.
Byron, did you have a question?
I had a comment. I recall, and it still may be around, there was a CO2 transfer between industries. There was some discussion that I think it was probably in the 80s or 90s where, you know, one polluting industry could transfer their carbon emissions to another industry. This is not what you're talking about, not at all, but they have been playing with this for a while.
Well, that's called cap and trade.
Yeah.
And it is in effect regionally in some parts of the country. I think in the Midwest, and it is potentially a way to help. I've never particularly liked it because it pays people to pollute.
Yeah.
And but it's in effect in some parts of the world too.
Yeah, and for us, it's, you know, if you move your carbon pollution from one sector to another, the winds don't respect that and move it back.
Right.
The forest fires out west, we're getting the effects of that. So.
Yeah.
A tip, what about locally, you know, state by state or city? I mean, that sometimes is the way things have been getting done on a lot of big issues that can't seem to be resolved in Congress.
Well, I think it's a very good point. And as you know, the Sustainability Committee has sponsored several successful efforts to have the town lead the way, things like plastic bags and styrofoam, etc. My next effort is to try to get them to change the town comprehensive plan to be the way it was intended by the Sustainability Committee when I left it in 2013, which was to set a carbon neutral goal for the town of by 2040. I put that in the draft sustainability plan in hopes that it would cause people to move. What it caused was one of the town board members, who's no longer a town board member, changed it all so that they basically neutered it. So my next step, which starts tomorrow at the Sustainability Committee meeting, is to change that and get the town to be serious about a climate action plan, which other towns have done, that shows how we can meet this. The idea isn't that Southampton town would move the needle on global climate change, but that what I found is that the states listen to the towns, and eventually the federal government may listen to the states. So doing it from the bottom up is about the only option we have right now. I hope that answers your question, Kevin.
No, I mean, I think it is possibly a way to do things. I mean, we live in New York City a lot, most of the time. And, you know, Sandy was such a game changer. And, in terms of the what we saw with rising seas and the floodings of subways and stuff. So they're forced into addressing the issues.
Yeah, sometimes kicking and screaming, but
Yeah, well, that's right.
Mhm.
What has de Blasio or anyone else in the city, done in response to the subways being flooded?
I recall we had an apartment in New York when that happened, and the flood came up our street close, actually. And one of the people in our building was an activist, and he was trying to get New York to build a series of blocks in in the harbor, the way London has done, to prevent the Thames River from flooding London, and it worked. So right now, the only thing I'm aware of is a lot of studies by people, but no specific actions. But I'm not necessarily up to speed on it.
Yeah, I'm aware of some proposals to put locks on the east end of the East River. But that has, beyond protecting from the flooding, it has lots and lots of environmental consequences
Right.
beyond that.
Yes. I think if I can mention it one more time, the experts think that the best way we can fight climate change is to put a price on carbon. And I have, if you will bear with me for 2 minutes, I have something to show you. Let's see. How do I get back to sharing my screen? Oh, it's down here.
Yeah, it's at the bottom.
Yeah, got it. Okay. This says it better than I can.
The climate is changing. Extreme weather is disrupting livelihood.
Let me just make it bigger. Come on.
There.
There.
You have it there now.
The climate is changing. Extreme weather is disrupting livelihoods and food supplies around the world. This is observed. This is documented. This is the scientific community's consensus. The climate is changing. Carbon emissions are driving that change. Emissions come from burning fossil fuels. So if we want to slow or even reverse the change, we must lower our fossil fuel use. By charging a fee on fossil fuel and returning that revenue to households as a dividend, we can do just that, starting a chain of positive effects. Fossil fuels become less desirable. Cleaner sources of energy become more
Sorry, was I muted during that
No,
whole?
I did that. That's my mistake. So,
Anyway, I thought that's a pretty good 2-minute summation of what we're doing and why.
did we all get to hear that, or was everybody shut off?
Well, we got to read all the captions, so it was pretty clear.
Okay.
Well, I won't bore you with doing it again, but I think you get the message.
Yes.
Yes.
have a
yes.
question.
The climate change issue is huge and is growing all the time. I've followed it through fisheries for 45 plus years. And it doesn't take much to find information that supports that things are changing.
Yeah.
So do we have other questions, comments?
I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
On the fee they plan on charging, how do you think they would equitably distribute that to the community?
It's distributed to every individual like a social security check. What happens is the fees go into a trust fund, which by law is limited to this purpose. And then the government sends a check every month to each of us. Adults get a full share and children get a half share, as I may have mentioned earlier. So it doesn't go to communities. It doesn't go to special interest groups. It goes to the individuals. And the mechanism already exists for doing that, obviously, through Social Security, for one thing.
But if everybody's not participating in this project, not doing what they should be doing, they're going to get an equal share whether they participate or not.
They get an equal share, but they pay more in tax and fee. That's the way the incentive works. If you own an Escalade, say, and get whatever they get in mileage, or you own a Prius, then you'll end up paying more in fees for the Escalade than you get back, because we all get the same amount back. So
So someone that lives in the city that doesn't have a car, an apartment, will still get an equal share.
they get an equal share, but they pay less in fees.
Because they're not buying fuel. Okay,
Right. That's
Thank
the way it works.
thank you. Good answer.
Anyone else?
I would just like to say that if your presentation could be aired on national television, it is so, you made it so clear, so simple and believable. And I wish I could carry a video on my phone and just, take bus rides and subway rides and show it to people whether they want to see it or not. Ram it down their throats.
Thank you, Adrian.
Oh, you're very welcome. I mean, finally, more people are now, taking their vaccinations because Trumpers are finally saying, that you ought to. And if only that same kind of thing, if something like that would happen, that would motivate people to say, oh yeah.
That's the trouble with a long-term problem.
Yes.
Oh, you're muted.
Catherine, you're muted.
Okay.
Thank
What do you think? Okay. What do you think about the proposal that was put forward in this infrastructure bill to tax the people who use electric cars for the electrical stations or charging places?
I think that's the kind of proposal which is designed for a particular congressman's base.
Yeah.
It isn't designed to help the rest of us.
So we're trying to, you're trying to propose more electric cars, and then so that then, and people would be paying more money for a car that uses gas and gasoline.
They would be, actually, the beauty of what Citizens Climate Lobby proposes is they aren't actually proposing any specific action. They're simply saying, okay, we're going to reward people who burn less fossil fuels. That's all. And they're hoping that when people eventually see what's happening, that they'll do like anything else. The increased cost and price of fossil fuel will cause them to change.
Right, right.
And historically, if you look at these fees that they're talking about, as I said, these are not small numbers. They may seem to be small numbers, but when you look at the amount of CO2 that's generated by these fossil fuels, they can really affect an industry.
Yeah, yeah. So you would, I mean, you would be really trying to encourage people to use solar power and.
I would, yeah, whatever would generate the electricity we need on a carbon-free basis, which, by the way, at the moment is mostly nuclear power plants.
Yes. Are you advocating for that?
Oh, I would definitely advocate for it. I don't think we can get there without them. 50% or 55% of our carbon-free electricity is generated by nuclear. 20% is by hydro, roughly 20% by wind, and 7.4% by solar.
Is the public more willing to accept nuclear power plants?
You know, it's interesting you would ask that. My wife will probably roll her eyes at this too often, but when I was responsible for nuclear research and development for the Department of Energy, a guy called me who does an annual survey on people's thoughts about nuclear power. He's been doing it for decades. And so after he asked me his questions, I asked him some questions. And I said, well, what do people really think? Because I'd seen the data in the past years, and the majority of people always say we should have more nuclear power plants. And what he said is, well, the public thinks we should, by almost the same percentage. The leaders in the administration, including Congress, think we should. And when you ask the Congress what they think the public thinks, the congressmen think the public opposes it. And so I think the nuclear power industry has done a terrible job of selling themselves, but the anti-nuclear people have done a fantastic job of saying negative things about nuclear power. I testified to Congress on this subject and looked a senator in the face, and when I told him some facts about nuclear, not that particular fact, he tended not to believe me, even though I could prove it. He didn't believe me because he's been told for years what the anti-nuclear people want to tell. So I'm just sorry, but if that sounds partisan, but I think it's far too important to be bashful about the benefits that nuclear power are providing right now, but will go away because we're not building new plants. The Chinese are building 23 nuclear plants. course, they're building a lot more coal-fired plants.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And,
it's,
but you feel that it can be done safely. I think that's really the issue for us. I mean, we all remember 3 Mile Island, or what, I think that was the name.
I remember 3 Mile Island in particular because I was there.
Oh.
And so our client, I worked for an architect engineering firm, and I was responsible for a nuclear power plant we were building for them. And it was the same utility that owned 3 Mile Island. And the company I worked for had designed the non-nuclear part of it. Anyway, so we went down within a week or so after the accident and worked around the clock building special backup systems, and etc. No one was hurt by 3 Mile Island.
Yeah.
And no one was hurt by Fukushima. I'm not advocating Fukushima in particular was a terrible thing because of all the people who were displaced. But the 20,000 people who died in Japan were not killed by the nuclear power plant. So I think you really have to look at these things objectively. And objectively, nuclear power is either the safest or one of the safest means we have of generating electricity. So that's my opinion, having spent a few years in the field.
Compared to wind and solar.
You convinced me months and months and months ago at one of my first meetings in the library that nuclear power plants were a good thing.
Well, I had a friend who was very vehemently anti-nuclear. This was back in the 70s. And he and I used to have these discussions. About 20 years later, he told me, I convinced him, but he was reluctant.
Does Citizen Climate Lobby, do they lobby for nuclear power?
They don't lobby for any solution, but if you go on their website, you will see the background filled with windmills. And at one point, they had on their website the statement they were quoting by a person who claimed that we could generate all our electricity from all our energy, not just electricity, all our energy from renewables. We could do it in 20 years and it would be cheaper than fossil fuels. And that was such a ridiculous statement that the scientists who really study this thing, they didn't even bother replying to it. But then it turned out that groups like Citizens Climate Lobby were picking up this statement as if it were gospel. So there's the other side, did a study, pointed out that the first study was totally incorrect in myriad ways. And it showed up in the New York Times 3-4 years ago, I think, as a front page article. But yes, some people choose to believe this. People who know the field don't. So sorry, this has become a discussion.
That's okay. This is useful.
Yeah.
And
Tip, could you remind me the information you told me about the energy that the country of France is getting from nuclear power?
Well, France generates more of their electricity from nuclear power than any other country. Of course, it's smaller than us. We have more plants. We generate about 20%. They generate 75% of their electricity from nuclear. And I did a back of the envelope calculation over several hours a few years ago to see what it would take to generate all of our electricity that's now fossil fuels from nuclear power plants. And the answer turned out to be we'd have to build 300 to 400 nuclear power plants. And that sounds daunting, except we already have 100. And not only that, if we did build that many, we would have 40% of the density, if you will, of nuclear power plants that France already has. So it would take a long time. We've let our nuclear industry go to seed, but there are other nuclear industries out there, in Europe in particular, China and Russia, who would love to build our nuclear power plants.
Is there anybody in the is the head of the Department of Energy, whose name I don't know, presently advocating for some of these, for the policies that you've been discussing or are looking at nuclear power?
They are. The current secretary of the department is the former Michigan governor.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
I forget her name right now. But both she and the Trump administration, for that matter, are pushing for more nuclear power. But it's such a politically sensitive subject, but that the way they frequently do it sort of kills the idea. They'll say, well, the next generation of nuclear power plants will be safer, et cetera, which makes it seem that the current generation isn't, which is, so the answer is, yeah, they're mellowing a little bit compared to the Clinton administration, for example, which was in power when I was there.
I think that Michigan governor, I can't remember her name, it's a Scandinavian name, but she said that she had really proposed a lot of things in Michigan, you know, to save, reduce fossil fuels, et cetera. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I think, is it Gretchen Whitmer?
Gretchen, yeah, I don't know.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah,
Gretchen Whitmer. That's good.
Gretchen Whitmer. Oh, that's not Scandinavian. Yeah.
Yeah, they may have. I mean, in the Midwest, there's, and in the southeastern United States in particular, where are only 2 nuclear power plants under construction are located, you'll find less objection than you do in the Northeast.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like there's a lot of education that needs to be done.
I think we need some leadership too. That goes along with it.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you know what Bernie Sanders thinks of CCL?
I don't specifically know. I'm sure he's in favor of CCL, though but I don't recall reading anything with his opinions. Anything else?
Well, I was thinking about AOC and the senator from Massachusetts. They had a green proposal a year and a half, maybe before COVID, but I don't know the details, but And I can't remember the name of the senator from Massachusetts. And yeah.
They had what they called the Green New Deal.
Yeah.
The green, and I've read it. It's not long. It's about 3 or 4 pages, if I recall. It is basically the platform of the Green Committee, which they adopted and called the Green New Deal.
The Green Party.
Green Party. It does not support nuclear power. It assumes that we can do it all by renewables.
Why can't we?
Yeah.
Which you're saying is not possible.
Well, it's not me. I haven't done the study, but in the National Academy of Publications of the National Academy, 23 scientists and engineers took the earlier study that claimed that it was possible and poked a zillion holes in it. I'm all in favor of renewables. We have 10 kilowatts of photovoltaics out behind our barn. It's been great. Thank you all for financing it. So I'm in favor of that. The physics is against it. The physics being the density of the energy that falls on the earth, the fact that wind and solar are a function of when the weather allows them to happen and not when the need is there. And the fact that with one minor exception, all those solar energy panels don't have energy storage backup. And whenever you read about a new solar farm, and there's one being built, of course, here, or will be built, I assume, off East Hampton, you read things like 150 megawatts of energy storage. And when I went to the presentation and tried to get them to put that in the only terms that make sense, which is megawatt hours, they wouldn't.
Explain.
So they assume, or the average person assumes when reading the publicity, is that there is energy storage that will back up the windmills when there's no wind. But there isn't. The energy storage that they have planned is simply to level out minute changes in the wind, so that if the wind speed changes radically, you can level that out with energy storage for a few minutes. But it's not storage in the sense that either a nuclear power plant or a fossil plant has 30 days worth of coal, or a nuclear plant has 2 years worth of fuel. It's not that at all. That's the fundamental problem. So, but as I say, I have my photovoltaic panels and I love them.
How did you go about getting those?
Well, we got them 7 or 8 years ago when they were really pushing the rebates. So had I bought them on the market and had them installed, it's a ground mounted system, it would have cost $70,000. But thanks to all the rebates and the tax credits, it was only $23,000.
And it's paid itself back.
And it's paid itself back. But as I say, it's the taxpayers who paid the $50,000. And the good news is that the panels are cheaper now, so the rebates are less. And that was one of the purposes of the rebates, was to make the panels, make more panels to make them cheaper. So that's good.
But don't they have about a 20-year life expectancy?
They're usually 25.
25.
That's the panels themselves. And as I said, I've had ours. We've had ours now for 7 or 8 years, and we haven't had any problems. It's unlikely that the panel would fail. It's more likely that the inverter is used to translate the direct current that they generate into alternating current. It's more likely that that would need repair eventually.
We don't have bills.
But, you know, life has changed. In case you're thinking of buying them, when I bought mine and their grandfather, the meter runs backwards. So when I'm generating electricity, I'm not charged for that. And it goes into a bank. So in the summer, my electric bill, which used to be, well, in the winter, it was maybe $600 or $700 a month. In the summer, it's $15 a month. That's the meter charge. But life has changed the rules. They no longer run the meter backwards. They have a complicated formula that I haven't figured out because it doesn't apply to us, which probably results in less money to the homeowner. I assume that's why they do it. And I don't blame them in a way. If you look at, if I have solar panels, my meter runs backwards, but the cost of electricity includes much more than just the cost of the fuel that I'm saving in some power plant somewhere. There's transmission lines, there's backup power plants for when the sun doesn't shine. All those things I'm not paying for. The people who don't have solar panels are paying for us, and that's why they want to change the rules.
Well, it's always good to hear something positive about LIPA. That is good. It's good.
Why?
Thank you, Tip. I'm in Wyoming and we gotta go. I gotta go.
Okay.
Go look at the magpies and the moose and the bears. Which I've seen a lot of them today. I've seen them today. Anyway, it's nice.
That's great.
Okay. Yeah, it is great. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Any other questions or comments for Tip?
Leave.
Tip, I want to thank you for a
Thank you.
pleasant presentation, a great presentation, and some very good conversation at the end. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Any other last words from anyone?
I just wanted to say thank you. This is Susie. Tip, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
All right. With that, we'll thank everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Everybody, stay well.
Bye.
Thank you.
Tip. Bye.